Right, I'm recording now. Hopefully it goes okay. Fingers crossed. But I'll have to sort that out. So this is the final one of these types of lessons. But I do focus a lot on medicine as well. On the Wednesday. But based on the lessons, I think you guys will like Wednesday anyway, because it's just all the little weird and quirky things. And because medicine's something I focus on a lot, it does crop up quite a bit as well. So I thought I'd look at the English Civil War because I thought this might be quite interesting to look at and analyse, and it definitely was. It was something that was quite interesting and brought a lot of debate to it. I think compared to other topics that we've discussed, I feel like this is a lot of research and a lot of easily accessible research and sources as well to it, which is great. And this is what we like. So this is something this is a war that happened. The English Civil War happened between the 22nd of August 1642 to the 3rd of September 1651, and it was a very significant one for many things. But we're going to look at how significant it was in terms of medicine. So you had the Parliamentarians, which were the Roundheads, versus the Royalists, which were the Cavaliers, and they had recognised in this war how significant medicine was, and how that can change the course of a war itself. And a lot of people were injured in the English Civil War. And this, I think, is very significant because it held the fate of the governments of Ireland, Scotland and England, but I think it was important on just how they were able to professionalise medicine and how we learned from medicine through a time of conflict. I have noticed that in times of conflict, you do get some very interesting pieces of artefacts of the medical care and the procedures there. One thing that I did like seeing, and was a very nice thing that they put in there, was when I went to Belgium, for example, in Ypres, there's like a church that's been turned into a museum now, and I still have the wristband on my thing. Is a wristband that you could put things up and they give you information, and there was a medicine bit, and it was just amazing, all the archaeology. And I find that really on a whole, conflict can show us a lot about medicine, and this is one that has a lot of rich archaeology as well. And the petitions of this campaign afterwards, it showed us how there was a better understanding of medical care, how there was more empathy in people, how people wanted to do things more. And this brought attention to a lot of medical academics as well. And this legacy has lasted us right up until now as well, which is an amazing thing, how we can still see some things that we've taken from this period. And that's what I want to discuss as well. So I think what I'm trying to say is, yes, we should look at the politics of this, and we should look at the military side of this. However, as someone who's really interested in medicine, I think it's very significant that we look at the medical aspect of it as well. And this is something that has seen a lot of bloodshed. So it's estimated between 180,000 or 190,000 people have died from combat or war-related diseases in England and Wales alone between 1642 to 1651. And this is the First World War, for example, is considered regarded as a conflict that has resulted in a great loss of British lives, and the Second World War one had the greatest impact on civilian population. Yet, if the estimated that I've just given you is accepted and is correct, then there's a lot of evidence to indicate that a larger percentage of British Isles population died as a direct result of the civil wars. Now, I done a module on the history of violence, and it was very interesting, especially the discussions that we had each seminar. We had to team up with people and do a presentation each week, and being someone in second year at the time, that was horrifying to do a presentation every week for 15 minutes. You're having a laugh, whereas now it seems like something that it's a breeze for me now, and it just does make me chuckle. But we kicked off so much because I think we had to do this every week, and it only equated to 20% of the marks, and we felt like it should have been more. And I think with the amount of time and effort that went into it, I believe so. But we were discussing in our last seminar violence over time, and we got to this discussion of how really it can be a very touchy topic to compare conflicts to each other and which one's worse, really. But I think here they're just sort of showing how big of a population was had died due to this, or because of this. And they said that most historians consider that the civil wars were the most unsettling experience the British and Irish peoples have ever undergone at home. And what I'm trying to show you is, as people of a modern visitor of this time period, is to look at the human cost of life in these wars, but how we're able to have an understanding of medicine because of that as well, and how this has affected ultimately politics as well. It's very interesting how they've all connected to each other. So what I've got here, this is the name of it online, and basically the short name of it is Approved Medicines of Little Cost in 1651 by Richard Elkies, and that's just what it looks like online if you want to have a look at it. I tried to find the actual manuscript of it, but of no luck. But however, it was very interesting just to read this, because sometimes it's much easier because you don't have to try and get to grips with handwriting, etc. Sometimes you just want to read the transcription. And this is a period that has had, you see that their treatments, it's a time period where I think they start to realise that although they follow Galen and Hippocrates and all the other Greek philosophers in medicine and the great founders of medicine, although they are a great inspiration to their medical theories, their remedies, they believed in the humours and the balance of things, so that was still going. So a lot of people sort of brush past this period because it's very similar to the medieval period. But if you look at these wars, you start to realise that they are starting to notice that maybe this isn't the way to go with medicine. But from what we can I think we need to stop having that idea that they were very incompetent and hopeless with their medicine, because it's about how they were able to trial and error with it all. But like I said, it was classical Greeks that influenced them with the four humours. Again, black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. Those are the important ones to look out for. And the medical practice was based on practical experience and observation, so empirical observation and being rational about it. And they had specific drugs for specific treatments, and they even pushed this to have this at home as well. So more textbooks were being made to be accessible for people who are wounded and couldn't go to a hospital, because that was something that wasn't very cheap. But in this book, there was recommended treatments for all sorts of things, like typhus, scurvy, scabies, lice, and even shot wounds. And he showed how we could use low-cost items that can be carried by a soldier every day, or even kept by a householder, to just prevent disease and common disease in crowded military camps as well, with poor sanitation. And you could see how physicians exercised control over the administration of medicines that were taken internally and externally as well. But these physicians are normally graduates from Oxford and Cambridge. So we're seeing a professionalisation here of these physicians. And many textbooks were produced from 1640 to 1666. So this is right in the middle of it all. And they have some practical values, and they were ways for medical professionals to use this and come to their own remedies and beliefs and arguments in what they think was the best way to deal with something. And you have this split then between the traditionalists, the Galenists, which was symbolised by the College of Physicians, or you have the modernists, which were the Helmontians or the Paracelsians. And they looked towards Alennius Galenus, who was a prominent Greek physician, surgeon and philosopher, and he really understood anatomy and medicine and this whole idea of the influence of the humours as well. And his theory started to push themselves their way into these medical textbooks as well. And apocryphacy, like a pharmacy, they were licensed by a society, and the drugs and the medication that were used in London's military hospital, for example, the Savoy and Ely House were dispensed from a central pharmacy in Ely House, where they could conduct their business. And unfortunately, the specific ingredients that were used by these men have been deliberately obscured, a protective measure against revealing their mysteries. Fortunately, an inventory compiled in 1657 for the purchase of the stock and equipment of Ely House from Mrs. Mary Bateman, who was a widow of a recently deceased pharmacist there, survives to illustrate the nature of their department. And the items were listed under basic generic terms such as a purin potion, a purging potions, the tablets, the tonic, rather than the specific product's name in the not the actual scientific name. And they even charge people for these potions, these diet drinks, these powders, juices, all sorts of things, which obviously could have been a lot as well. They even use chalk for indigestion, which seems to be used now as well with especially things with magnesium to stop the indigestion and make the person feel very settled and a-okay. So you get to fatal sicknesses that was something that they had to look out for, soldiers, but without looking out for anyone to go and kill them. So you have typhus, for example. There was an epidemic typhus disease that was caused by a specific bacterium and is transmitted through lice bites. So if you're in a cramped military camp, that's not going to go down very well. And the most common symptoms, it included a headache, high fever, chills, and a typical rash. And if it left untreated, it could have brought drowsiness and confusion, which again wouldn't have been very good. And with it being very easily distributed through lice in military camps, is something that they really did not want. And this led to fatal complications, leading to less soldiers. They believed that there was bleeding from the insides that led this fatal complication. And whereas nowadays the survival, the mortality rate for untreated typhus is 15%. So whereas back then you were doomed. And armies, like I said, they were constantly moved with lice. So this is something that they really had to look out for and be careful. And they even described it as the camp fever as well, whenever someone had got ill from that certain illness. So that was something that they really had to look out for, this big deadly disease, really. But Jared's Herbal, is a book of herbal medicine that belonged to the Cooper family, a village 7 miles from Newark. And the Coopers were royalists, and their house was fortified and garrisoned for the king. And Sir Roger Cooper had briefly forfeited his estate after Thurgoon House had fell to the parliamentary assault in December 1644. And you can see that he put forward a work to deal with injury and illness and disease, because he realises how many people are dying, especially from the littlest of diseases. So he starts looking at ointments that are curable by certain plants. He even looked down to looking at even down to symptoms in a very scientific way, rather than just describing them as the 4 humours. And he was a royalist who helped with a hospital in England. So gangrene is also another issue that they had to deal with, which was a condition where the body tissue, such as the skin and muscle, rots away and dies. And it occurs when the blood flow to the area is restricted, and it's normally due to an infection of a wound or health problems which affected the blood circulations, like diabetes. But gangrene is most commonly affects the extremities. So this was sort of turning hands black and legs, and sometimes it could have even affected internal organs, and eventually this would have killed someone. So with a lot of infections going around, in terms of say a gunshot wound, and that got infected, that would lead to that, for example. So there was loads of other ways, and there was loads of ways that they looked out for, and Jared's Herbal definitely tried to look at ways to find ointments, but did not succeed. They even had the bubonic plague to look out for, and this was definitely prevalent during wartime conditions. It was spread by these marching armies, such as Prince Rupert's forces, who arrived in Newark in October 1645. And what we see here is a document where each plague death is marked by a cross. So they didn't have signatures by that day, it was just a cross. And at the start of the parish burial register for 1646, the scribe had recorded that all those names that register for all those names that have ye cross before them did die of ye plague. And at the end of the year, he recorded with a heavy heart, they died of a plague. By the end of the year, he recorded, sorry, wrong thing. He died of the plague 80 and 10, and thereof the plague 19. So really going on about how many people are dying, and from what we can gather here, about 340 people had died in a small amount of time in some of the documents. If you just look at just a couple of pages, and it doesn't take up much, you can see how many people are on there. And he's just sort of showing how that this scribe is sort of showing with a heavy heart the bloodshed and everything that is coming as a result of conflict, really. And this is something that needs to be done because of this lack of medicine. So that's what this was calling out to people, really. And this has led to a legacy of physicians wanting to lower the death toll, really, in anything. So you've got this with physicians, doctors, surgeons, nurses, pharmacists, midwives. They all played their part, and even their wives, and they, especially the doctors, etc., they ended up working towards traditions that are held today that ensured that they looked after the health of many of their patients, and ensure that every life was at least saved, or they tried to. So the next one now, I want to go to surgery, because despite there being a lack of antibiotics, military surgery was very significant and saved so many lives. And these wars witnessed great advancements in bone setting, prosthetics, and medical cleanliness as well, which is important. Military surgeons accompanied the armies at regimental and even company level as well. And many surgical treatises were published to share new medical practice, such as John Woodall's The Surgeon's Mate, which had went through 4 editions by 1655. And then you have Friar Moulton's Complete Bone Setter, which was republished in 1656. And this had given physicians helpful advice, which is still relevant to today, on how to deal with fractures, for example. Early forms of plaster and splinting were devised to support fractured limbs when they healed. And many amputations were performed, and hospital carpenters made prosthetic limbs. Some of them were remarkable for their sophistication and their craftsmanship as well. And surgery is important to ensure that there's a good health and welfare of the patient and the soldier, or if they are one, that's it. But this was also said to be inspired by a Frenchman, Ambroise Paré, in 1510 to 1590. And his teachings had he just asked for applications of ligatures to arrest hemorrhage instead of the drastic cauterization previously advocated. So he recommended the application of egg yolk oil, oil of roses, on gunshot wounds to help ensure that it was sterile, it was clean. And he had some great innovative surgical instruments and prosthetic limbs. And it is distinctively probatable that Thomas Trapham, Oliver Cromwell's personal surgeon, followed Paris' teaching and methods as Savoy Hospital, but sadly there is no surviving record of this. It's just down to just theorising. Fortunately, the royalist surgeon, Richard Wiseman, had published works on advice to fellow surgeons in the main, closely following Paris' teachings as well. And so when you look at Richard Wiseman, the royalist, he was from 1620 to 1676. He was a surgeon to the Prince of Wales, the future King Charles II, during the First Civil War. He was his personal surgeon from 1646, and Wiseman had worked through many battles, including Dunbar in 1650, Worcestershire in 1651, and during the 1650s, he practiced as a surgeon in England and had spent a few brushes with the authorities and some years in the Spanish Navy as well. And he was made a surgeon in ordinary for the person of Charles II after the Restoration at the King's own request. And he had a successful career after this as well. And Wiseman had gained a lot of medical knowledge from his practical experience on the battlefield. Like I said, this times conflict, this makes people learn because they have to learn. They have no time, they have to, it's life or death. And in his book, he outlines medical procedures and describes over 600 patients that he has seen in his time, including their wounds, their treatment, and their outcomes, whether it was good or bad. And this made Wiseman so exceptional that he adopted a scientific approach as well to analysing the effectiveness of his treatments, which was quite useful, I think, for his time. But he was very popular with his writings, and he had an impact on the development of the surgical practice within Britain. But when you look at the parliamentarians, James Cook, for example, of Warwick, he became a physician and surgeon to Robert, second Lord Broke of Warwick Castle, around about 1637. And when Brooke had become commander of the Warwickshire Parliamentary Forces in 1642, Cook served as a surgeon to the sick and wounded at Warwick's Castle's garrison. And he used his experience as a physician and a surgeon in 1648 when he published his book, Marrow of Many Goods authors, Where is the Art of Surgery? And he gave advice on treatment and acknowledged classical medical texts as well as English surgeons like John Woodall's The Surgeon's Mate. And his third edition retained his belief that traditional theory of balancing the four humours was the great way of going. But however, people have sort of gone through that and have attacked that, and it's not something that we no longer believe. So it's quite interesting that he's starting to have this, you're starting to see more of a scientific approach in the methodologies as well, which I think is amazing. And we get to the aftercare of this now. The history of British military nursing, it did not begin with Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War. It didn't. Civil War nursing was not restricted to the efforts of camp followers or members of the poorest levels of society. The wars were led by the establishment of Britain's first permanent military hospitals. This was professionalisation. This wasn't leaving it to the poorest in society, to the ones that weren't fighting the battles. And both sides had military hospitals, and I think you definitely start to see a difference in practice as well from the doctors, surgeons and nurses on each side. I think we've seen that in terms of looking at James Brooke and Richard Wiseman, how Richard Wiseman was being very scientific in his way, where James Cook was being following the classics really. And I think you should follow the classics, but not take it as Bible gospel, challenge it, that is what scientific experimentation is about, is testing things, see if it works. And this is the Savoy, which is in London, which is one of the first military hospitals as well, and it was in 1642, and it was by the parliamentarian side as well. And this had a chapel in it as well, and there was a lot of access from the sea to it as well. This was a big hospital, showing that they needed this type of institution to ensure that everything was being dealt with. And if anyone's got disease, they're not mixing with anyone in society that have not got anything to do with war, really. And then Ely House was made in 1648 as well. And this had the same sort of thing. It had a chapel in it. Patients could walk in the fresh air for protection with protection from the elements. There was large gardens. There was a herb garden. There was medicinal plants. So it was almost like this. Well, we see this in a lot of the classical periods as well, where they have a place of worship right next to a place of medicine, or in the same building as each other, really. And this, that Ely House as well, especially the fact that they've got big gardens, they understood the need of the well-being mentally, but even though if they didn't explicitly say it. And they have these use of these gardens for these plants as well, which I think is amazing. The Royalist hospitals, though, are very different, I think, when you compare them. They had a different ideology for starters. It seems like the parliamentarian hospitals were a little bit more professional. However, it seems that the royalist ones are the ones that stayed in place. The parliamentary ones were also in cities, whereas the royalist ones were quite far away, in quiet villages. And there was a medical and isolation hospital, but there was no focus, I think, on having people nearby to come and help, because I think eventually you do need help. There was a churchyard nearby. It looked like the royalists, the way they were set up, the fact that it was near a churchyard, the fact that they've had so many graves there, it seemed like they had a higher death toll compared to the parliamentarians. And I think that is part of the thing to come into play on, you know, who was hindered, really. And it's down to medicine. And it's important to have these institutions because you're caring for them, and I think you're getting them back to this, to a very adequate health and looking after themselves. But I think also the spirituality part of it as well is it shows that it's important to have a spiritual side to medicine. There's always going to be that link, and especially with it not being so different, and especially with after the Restoration, it's not going to be as strict as the medieval period in terms of needing God's forgiveness, but it definitely will be an aspect of it. So Sir Thomas Fairfax from 1612 to 1671. He was a commander-in-chief, a parliamentarian commander-in-chief from 1645 to 1650. And he had so many wounds and injuries, and it was a lot of them. And he ended up needing a wheelchair to support himself due to all of this. And I think it just sort of shows really how much of a great figure he was in this battle, because he didn't stop once he got wounded, once he kept going, and it was something that he felt strongly about. And I think you could just see that. So that's a photo of him on top there, and that's his wheelchair, which is very well preserved, and I think it's the first one you kind of see like that, the earliest one really. I think anyone you find before is not going to be in great state, especially with the medieval period. The only way that I could get reference to a wheelchair was through illuminated manuscripts, and even then it didn't really tell you much. But this was significant because it just shows how much he felt passionate about fighting for this side. And he was shot in the wrist in Selby in 1643. He was slashed by a sword across the face at Marston Moor in 1644. He was shot in the shoulder at the siege of Helmsley Castle later that year in 1645. He had written to his father, "I'm exceedingly troubled with the rheumatism and the benumbing coldness in my head, legs and arms, especially on the side that I had my hurts." During the Protectorate Parliament in 1659, one MP had marvelled, "I bless God that he, having received so many wounds, now sits on my right hand." His cousin, Brian Fairfax, had recalled how from 1666 he restored to his wheelchair, where he sat like an old Roman, in his matronly countenance striking awe and reverence to all that beheld him. So what you can tell from these witnesses, there's a great respect for him, because he just kept going and going and going, and he got himself to a stage where he has to rely on a wheelchair, but this is seen as something amazing, because he really done his all. He paid his service to them, and he then sort of was there helping make the decisions, and he was in awe of everyone around him. And I think if you don't see how great status his wheelchair is, because it's very well, beautifully detailed, if you don't see how well detailed that is to show his wealth and his status, you look at that photo, if that doesn't tell you much, then you look at the bottle with the cup. It's almost like a little flask, and that's beautifully designed as well. And this was this was of kind permission of his descendant that people were able to see these of Thomas Fairfax. You just see, even just down to bottle, it screams opulence and just high status. You could just see he was very well respected from the parliamentarians, and I think there's something they really wanted to focus on. But I think we should just focus on a few other individuals that obviously will not have as much limelight as him. So Elizabeth Alkin, known as Parliament Joan, in 1655. For 12 years, from 1643 to 1655, this lady had served the parliamentarian cause as a nurse, an informer, and a newspaper publisher, so she had done a lot on her part. She was accused of spying for Parliament, and her husband was executed in Oxford in 1643, but Elizabeth remained in Oxford, caring for wounded soldiers and held prisoner in Oxford's jails, while secretly supplying the parliamentary generals with military intelligence. In 1646, Elizabeth had returned to London. She occupied the house of a man who had denounced her husband and discovered undergoing royalist printing presses to the authorities. So ultimately, she was helping the parliamentarians. Someone had snitched, whatever you want to call it, on her husband and her. He ends up being killed. She goes to jail. She still does her work. She's still fighting for the cause. She ends up taking the house off the person who had grasped on her husband and her. It was almost like, stuff you, I've got your house, and I found your printing press, and I'm just gonna give that in. I think it's a bit, you know, you've got to give it to a strong woman there. Probably annoyed quite a few people. And one royalist had even scorned her as a fat woman about 50 years old, who was the most effective ferret for the government and stationers. And all I can say is this is woman's helping care people as a nurse. She's, you know, she's helping the wounded. She's fighting for a cause against the royalists. She's, to me, seems like a very strong-willed woman. The fact that she's, you know, she's managed to take the house off the person that's caused a lot of heartbreak for her and put her in prison. So that's almost like sticking a middle finger up there. And then she finds the printing press and gives that in as almost another rub in the face to him. And it's almost like, I think you see this in history when you've got Donald Trump calling Hillary Clinton a whore, for example. It's quite interesting because you see that these men then sort of they end up going to resort to these name calling tactics whenever they feel threatened by a woman that seems very strong and it looks like she'll bring about change or be put down in the history books for change. And that's where she ends up being described as a fat woman about 50 years old. So what's that got to do with anything, really? And I feel it's quite funny that you see this sort of childish behaviour move on to today's politics, especially some of the names that you get. So it's a trend, really. But she carried on. She even she done a lot of news books as well. She informed people. She helped people to care for people who was wounded. So wives that needed help. And in Colchester in 1648. She was as an active nurse as well again. And in 1652, on the onset of the First Dutch War, she had volunteered to nurse sick and wounded soldiers and sailors as well. Sorry, the dog's just walked in. Get out. Get out. I don't even know how she does it. I could hear sniffing at the door and I thought it's a chihuahua. She can't open a door that I've wedged, but she has. I think she's feeling a bit lonely. I'm the only one in the house.
No, don't understand.
No, but we've got another dog. He's downstairs, but he's more chill. I think she's looking to steal heat off me because she gets cold quite easily. So yeah, this woman is, I think she's very significant, and she's you know, you've got to give her an applaud because she did put her help, not just through battle but at home as well. And she's done a lot of things, I think, that makes you think, go on. She didn't really care. She's been, you know, she was locked up and nothing stopped her. So just gonna quickly look at prosthetics, and this is from a 17th century sort of pamphlet that was being sent around as well. So you can have a look there. But they did compare that to a modern day one, and you can just see how some of the inspiration has come from the beginnings of these sorts of modern prosthetics, really. And this was because there was a large number of amputations that were being carried out on the battlefield. And they needed sophisticated equipment for those who had lost their limbs, and the cases were nursed under these amputation cases were nursed under bed cradles and supplied by a hospital carpenter. Like I said, they would have had one on site. They would address the wounds with red dyed cotton and linen bandages, which were frequently washed and reused. So there's this idea of hygiene now that's being brought in. Crutches were also supplied that ranged in length as well. They were able to have wooden splints that provided support for the fractures. They even had, in terms of cases with hernias, they had fitted fitted trusses as well. And in 1657, George Matheson had an above and knee amputee who was provided with a new artificial leg that fitted fitted with a leather box and plated over with iron, complete with swivels and pins. So they're movable. And in 1654, a soldier named Fisher was provided with a wooden hand as well. So this is just seen through documents. I couldn't find couldn't find this wooden hand, because it would have been quite good to look at the craftsmanship and how sophisticated it was. But the hospital carpenter remained available to outpatients as well, who just needed continued assistance. And I think that's where what we're coming to here is, this isn't medicine for a specific type of people. It seems that this was medicine for everyone, and they encouraged people to have help. And this led to a legacy that saw modern day prosthetics taking some sort of inspiration from this as well. And you definitely see that when it comes to things with World War II as well. But these high they've got a high standard of sophistication with everything that they use here, and that's what they want to focus on, really. So this just titles Wives, but I just didn't really know what to title this slide, and this is a quote as well, an extract of a petition of William Gilby of Rowell in Northamptonshire. He was a labourer as well, and he was awarded a pension of 30 shillings, sorry. He had the wives of the wounded soldiers had come together, and they started to it was complaints, really. These are what these legal manuscripts are. They're complaints, and what are you going to do about these complaints? That's what they're looking for, and they normally do have the conclusion in the end, which is how we knew of his pension. And professional help, sometimes it was very expensive, and that's something that they had brought to attention, because what was going on was that these wives were helping the wounded at home, especially their husbands, and it was taking a lot of their time. Not that they were complaining, but they also had to be mothers as well, and they also had to help out with the general community. And what they came to the court to do was that they said, listen, we've got these complaints, and we've got husbands here that can no longer work, or they're really injured, and we need help with the income, because obviously this is a time where women don't have as many freedoms as we did now. So I think they understood this. You start to see a beginning of empathy, and I think this is all down to the medieval period's civilizing process. People are starting to read more, and they start to understand other people's experiences and start to do solutions that are much better. And because of this, you start to see more medical textbooks being available with images to show you things. Like I said, some professional help had sort of gone out to be like a universal healthcare almost. There was bills, but some of them actually helped without taking any payment. This was just something I think was significant, because we're starting to see it's almost like a little form of socialism that they've got going on here, really, where they understand that they need help with something, and that's what's being recognised. And they were given a pension, so they recognise that these people are vulnerable and they need help in society. And I think it also comes down to those who help fight for their side, and they had those injuries. Well, it seems only fair to help them because they helped us. So that was their logic of it all. And it just led to this whole idea of welfare, really. Because these pensions were, these were just a lot of war widows, a lot of soldiers that come forward, a lot of wives of the soldiers that come forward. This image here shows a soldier with crutches, and I think he has a prosthetic leg, and then he's coming and he's telling everyone his problems as well. And this is something that's very significant. This is a charity table painting from St Nicholas Church in Warwickshire, and this was given by the kind permission of the church wardens as well. This was due to the lack of support of the public. They had campaigned for more help from the government. So it was almost like this political turn, and it had come from this conflict, but it brings in medicine. It's quite weird, I think, when I see politics and medicine together, because it just seems like my two favourite things have been put together, and you wouldn't initially put them together, but they have a good effect on each other. And people have started to recognise that maybe is this like some sort of early form of socialism that we don't really know about yet, where they're understanding that some people in society need help, and we need to recognise that they need help because we don't understand the same struggles as them. But the New Model Army ending the First Civil War in 1646, a fair deal for his soldiers and his widows became an important part of his national politics. And they sought to disband soldiers without properly settling their pay, without settling their pay, or giving them any help at all. And this ended up being something that was sparked a lot of rage, especially because they weren't having help medically as well. And they've started to talk about accusations of sending soldiers home without being paid, and this is a direct quote from Sir William Waller. Would not be misrepresented to the army. God knows I've never been wanting to pay in all just that never. I have never been wanting to pay it all just respect. I acknowledge the great services done by it. I have acted. I have voted for it. The ordinance of indemnity, the votes in favour of apprentices, the provision of maimed soldiers, widows and orphans for exemption from press, to every one of them occurrence. And I shall not say against it, for those who seem to be pillars or somewhat have contributed to nothing, given their flat negative of it. So what this is telling us, there is Parliament soldiers being left to be unpaid, and the commander-in-chief of the Parliament forces is sort of saying, well, this isn't true, and they clearly seem to have only done this, and he will not, he said that he's tried to vote for this, he's tried to do all this, he's not doing anything. And he's sort of saying, well, we've all done our bit for him, we're all not moaning, but this caused a lot of outrage, and they ended up sort of understanding there was a need, and there was a vote that was done to help with the pay of the soldier, that is described to be, you cannot detain the pay of a soldier that bleeds first. This is a cry of blood in it, and God will make inquisition of it. So it's almost like God starts getting involved here, where they have this on their mind, and they start to have this help in terms of medical care and welfare and payment, because people are not being able to do whatever they wanted to do afterwards because they're injured, or because their life has changed drastically due to some sort of illness, injury, disease, wound from this war, really. Now, when I come to this, one thing I will say is that I really don't like recreations in archaeology, because they make me feel a bit uncomfortable. Really do. But I felt like this was very important because it does show you something quite significant. So this is an archaeological case study, the Scottish soldiers. So we're going even more niche in our discussion here. And there was a mass grave found in 2013 in the city of Durham, and there was building work going underway, and it was going to be turning the courtyard into a cafe. And they started, a lot of archaeologists were being very watchful in this area, sort of keeping an eye out, and something caught their interest. It was a mass grave. And these skeletal remains were carefully excavated, and they were in very poor conditions. It seemed that the bodies had been placed on top of one another in different orientations. Some were face down. The grave did not represent careful placement of bodies, is what I'm trying to get to, and they had just been thrown in. And someone, the first question was this a result of a pandemic, such as a Black Death? But when they got back to the lab, they had analysed these bones, and it was determined they represented a minimum of 17 people. And it was likely there were many more in that grave, but it had been damaged or lost due to building work, and individuals could only be recovered from a small section of it now. And the mode of burial was quite unusual because it just showed the lack of care. And when they were having a look in the lab, they found some interesting features of the assemblage. The skeletons were mostly teenagers and young adults. All of them were male. There was no random cross-section of population as expected from a catastrophic disease epidemic. In addition, these skeletons showed signs of adversity in childhood, with evidence of poor nutrition and dental health. There was linear scratches on some of the bodies that showed indications of rodent gnawing as well. And this is, again, just this lack of care. They couldn't get over this lack of care. And they were like, why were so many people buried with so little care? It really confused people. So when they went and had a look at the radiocarbon dating, it indicated that the burials dated approximately 1650. And there was stable isotope evidence that suggested at least some of the individuals were not from the UK. Well, some might have been as well, but they were not local to Durham at all, and they were actually expressing values consistent with Scotland. When they were looking at the scientific evidence that was sort of integrated with this historical research, it was revealed that these individuals were soldiers, prisoners of war, in the Battle of Dunbar in 1650. The Scottish army was defeated by Cromwell's forces in Dunbar, Scotland, and the soldiers were captured, and approximately 4,000 of them were forced to march from Dunbar to Durham. Many died on the journey from hunger and disease. Once in Durham, they were locked in the cathedral as prisoners of war, and many more died. Bodies in the mass grave represent a small sample of these individuals. So this case study tells us some problems and potentials of interpreting a mass grave, because you have this haphazard body position and presence of buildings over some of the graves, which had made the excavation of individual bodies very challenging. Because of the constraints of the excavation and the mixing of the body parts, the evidence was a minimum number of individuals had to be calculated, and it was underestimated. Really, we're not really getting the full knowledge of it if we had a load of evidence. More evidence is better. Because the individuals were male and similar in age, this was difficult to assign some bones to particular bodies as well. And this was a common problem in bodies recovered from mass graves associated with conflict as well. When you looked at the skeletal analysis, it revealed that the early lives of these young men and their habits, so whether they were habitual smokers, using clay pipes, for example, that's what they were able to find out in some of them. Stable isotope analysis revealed that they were not local, that they were from Scotland, and it helped identify them, really give them an identity. When they looked at the DNA, for example, they could not tell who these individuals were because it was so far back in time, but it's not possible to establish a close relative match against samples of skeletons. But you can reveal features such as hair and eye colour from this. And the contextual data, so the historical information provided, was essential for the establishing the identity of these people, and the same in a modern forensic context with local intelligence and witness testimonies as well as documentation is important for the interpretation. And they've been able to recreate what this possible soldier would have looked like as well, just from these recreations and analysis as well, which is amazing. So the conclusion is that this has left a legacy in medicine in many ways. And treating patients is important to ensuring that I think you have a good chance of winning a battle, that you have a strong force and help stop the spread of disease to civilians that are not even involved. I think we start to see almost like a socialism in terms of pensions, in terms of healthcare as well. They understand the need of having this professional institution, although it did have bills to it, so the poorest of the poor couldn't really go there. But these medical textbooks were passed around as a way of helping people, especially with that first one I talked about dealing with medical issues, with things that are around the house, cheap things, even things that a soldier could have on him. And it was recognised as an important thing, especially in times of war. The British Civil War is left a lasting legacy in terms of politics, British history, but for medical historians, it's told us so much more. And it tells us of the beliefs and the inspiration from the past and how it's inspired the future. And I think that the professionalism of medicine has led to better hygiene, better care, and people are starting to challenge past theories, which has allowed them to get closer to some scientific ways of analysing medicine and how they work, which is something that we see. But you see that the parliamentarians seem to be very advanced in terms of medicine compared to the royalists, and that could be attributed really to who had done well compared to the other one. So that is the end of that today. So I'll ask questions. So Anne, is there anything that you'd like to ask?
I just wondered that I just think, you know, the parliamentarians and the royalists, they did have completely different, like you said, they have completely different, what's the word?
Schools of thought.
I can't think what word is now. But ideology, you know, they had completely different ideology, because the parliamentarians were more because of Cromwell.
Yeah.
So they were moving away from the church, like this, you know, years ago they would have the church involved with medicine and things, you know.
Yeah.
But this is like you know, the move away from royalty to secularism, and the church to secularism.
Yeah.
And so that's, it seems that it was an advance, you know, an advancement.
Yeah.
That they got rid of a lot of stuff that, you know, just wasn't really practical.
Yeah, and I like what you said there, Anne. You've made a good relation with the you know, this sort of not listening to the church so much and sort of taking, it's almost like it opened up for science to sort of have a space in the limelight, because people aren't saying you've got to have a spiritual practitioner before you have medical help. Thank you for that, Anne. Richard, anything that you'd like to ask or just add towards the end?
No, really interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. I've enjoyed doing these lessons with you, and I can't wait to see you guys on a Wednesday now as well. So take care and have a lovely week.
Thank you.
Ta-ra, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.